Well, if you are here, we are continuing our series, our vision series, where we are unpacking the three elements of our vision, which is being committed to Jesus, investing in each other, and then impacting the world. And this is both aspirational. It's things that we want to aspire to. It's a vision. A good vision always calls us further than where we are right now, but also realizing that it's very actual too, that we are doing these things. And so the vision never actually fully gets completed. It is something that we continue to strive for, that we continue to push further into. And because God is so deep in his infiniteness that we actually get to experience more of him the longer that we live. We actually we haven't experienced all of Jesus and now we're good. We actually get to push further into that. And I'm excited as we unpack this vision together. The first time through, we kind of looked at some biblical basis of what kind of formed this vision. And now we're kind of looking at some of the things that, how we actually live this out, how we play this out at MAC. What does it mean here at Morden Alliance Church to be a church that is investing in each other? And to do that today, we're going to be looking at a passage of scripture in Luke chapter 10. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to Luke chapter 10, or you can open it up on your phone on the YouVersion app, or you can just follow the screen behind me, which will also have the verses that are up there. So we'll dive right in here. Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Well, Jesus, being such a great teacher, responds with a question. He says, "Well, what is written in the law?" He replied. "Tell me, how do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." You'll be familiar that this passage was also used when people were asking Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? He actually used these two commands: love God with everything you have, love your neighbor as yourself, and everything else hinges on those two commands. You get those two things right, and all the rest of the law falls into place. Jesus replied, "You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" See, this person is an expert in religious law. He knows what it means. He understands that this is stirring in him, that this law that God has given him to love God with everything he has and to love others as himself. He knows that this is calling him to something. And he's really forced with the question here, does he love God enough to respond to this kind of demand? Because it could be rephrased. It could be rephrased as this. He could be saying, how can I, Jesus, tell me, how can I spot others that are like me so that I can love them? How can I spot others like me so I can love them? Because that is kind of what he's asking, who is my neighbor? He's wanting to be able to identify who is in and who is out. And if you are a good Jew, this would be important because you'd want to have connection and follow the law and be able to have that, to know that you're right standing with God. So you don't want to associate with people who are on the outside. But even in doing that, they've kind of forgotten what God had called them for. Because if you go way back to Genesis, the promise that was given to Israel was that Abraham was going to be a blessing to the entire world, that through him, the entire nations would be blessed. So if that's what he's supposed to be doing, is blessing the entire world, as soon as you limit that and put boundaries around that, on who is in and who is out, you've immediately begun to shrink God's scope of redemption for the world because you are more concerned with identifying others like me, because it becomes an us and them. We become at odds with it. And him asking this question kind of hints at this, that knowledge of what God requires is not enough. It actually needs to be put into practice. We can sometimes think that we just need one more sermon, one more Bible study. We just need to acquire just a bit more knowledge. And it's true, sometimes we do need to learn things. However, I am at a stage in my life, and you probably are too, where if we were to put into practice even 10% of the things that we know, we would be so much further ahead. But it's hard doing that. It's actually easier to acquire more knowledge and easier to put off saying, I actually can't take that step yet, Jesus, until you give me just a bit more knowledge, and then I might feel secure enough to take this step. And it's true, there is revelation that we do need, and revelation encourages us and spurs us on. But knowledge of what God requires is not enough. It needs action. And Jesus replies to him. He replies to him in a parable. And in reply, Jesus said, "A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite. And when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side." Now, let's go back to that verse there. If you've been in church for a while, you may have heard this story expounded on different reasons about why the priest may have passed him and why the Levite may have passed him. And that's not really what Jesus is getting at here. He's using these two very prominent people in Israel's life, priests who work in the temple, and Levites who are part of where the priests came from, the tribe that the priests came from. And he is highlighting that these two religious people, the people who should be most connected with God because they were actually put in charge of being the mediator between Israel and God, they were the ones who were supposed to be living this out in a way that was demonstrating God's love in this way. The point is that they just didn't help. He's telling the story. Here is a man who is in need of actual assistance, and the most important people in Israel's history, or in Israel's nation that would be connected to God, they went on the other side. In fact, I've heard it preached one time that, the priest couldn't touch him because then he would be unclean. Well, here's the thing, is that the religious people are always looking for reasons to justify their inactivity. Okay? Religious people are always looking for reasons to justify their inactivity. I can't help here because of X, Y, and Z. I need to avoid getting too close to this person because they're just a little too messy and I want to keep myself clean. Religious people are always looking for ways to justify it. Hence, the lawyer asking Jesus, well, really, who is my neighbor? He's looking for a reason to justify his inactivity because he knows what God is calling him to is so high. And is he willing to actually take that step? Jesus continues here. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and he saw him and took pity on him. Here's where Jesus puts the twist in, because this is not who he would be expecting. He would be expecting, if Jesus were telling this story, the character you'd be expecting is like a regular, pious Jewish man would come in. Maybe the priests and the Levites didn't get it, but this regular Jewish man would have got it. Instead, he surprises him. He puts in a Samaritan. And the reason why Jesus would do this is because he knows it would make the religious people uncomfortable. Because Samaritans, if you go back in Israel's history, back in the Old Testament when the one kingdom was broken in two and the Assyrians came and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and took them off into captivity, eventually those Jews, those Israelites who were taken away to captivity, they intermarried with the Assyrians. They kind of got resettled. They followed different practices, religious practices. They were not fully Israelite enough anymore. Well, the tribe of Judah, when they got taken away, they came back, and as this tribe of Judah, which is where we would get the term Jew from, Judah, this tribe of Judah, as they came back and committed to follow after Yahweh fully. And so they would look at their Samaritan cousins, let's say, as those who were inadequate. They were like half-breeds. They compromised on so much. So they were always at war with each other, at odds with each other, because they had different theologies. They thought about God differently than the other person. They had different political ideologies. And here comes this Samaritan who's brought in intentionally to put this Jewish leader this lawyer, on his heels. Out of all the people who would come to show pity on him, this would be a twist. Because normally you'd expect that the Samaritan would come and kick the guy when he's down and spit on him or something, and as political and religious enemies. But he took pity on him. I wonder what Jesus would use if he were telling that story today. What kind of character would he come that would make us feel really uncomfortable? I don't know. Could be a parable of the good Muslim, perhaps. I don't know. The parable of the good LGBTQ leader of the local chapter of gay rights. I don't know. Maybe it'd be the good Buddhist. Maybe a parable in a way they were like, oh, these people, they put me at odds. We don't agree on things. We view the world very differently. I wonder if Jesus would tell a story using a different character to us, just to get our attention about what it means to love your neighbor. Anyway, let's keep on reading. He went to him and he bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, which is about the wage of, that's about 2 days worth of wages, and gave it to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? This is interesting. The neighbor stood out for me. It's this active tense. We can sometimes think that, good fences make good neighbors, strong fences make good neighbors, whatever the saying is. But here, this is a neighbor which is active and it has no fence involved. And this one stood out to me because it's kind of this active tense, where neighbor is not passive, it's this active thing. And which one was the good neighbor? Verse 37, the expert of the law replied, well, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. This is interesting, because Jesus here, in his teaching on this, he rejects all attempts to shrink the scope and rejects all attempts to shrink the scope of responsibility, and he uses extreme examples of what it shows to love people. Because the religious people, and I can be really guilty of this too, because we understand that when Jesus changes us, we become different people. He meets us exactly where we are, but he changes us, and we begin to look different than we used to live. And by God's grace, this is called sanctification. We become more holy and more like Jesus, and as such, our lives reflect different things. And so we can be this is where religion comes in, and we begin to set up rules then about what you can and can't do, what you can and can't touch, what you can and can't eat or say or listen to or watch. And these rules, we think, are the thing that makes us holy. And so we then like to put up these walls saying, I don't want to do what you're asking me to, Jesus, because this makes me uncomfortable. I like the black and white rules about who is in and who is out, who I can love and who I should reject, who I can embrace and who I can despise. And Jesus comes in and he just rejects that attempt that I would have, that this lawyer would have, that I think, if we're honest, we all have, to shrink the scope of responsibility of what it means to follow Jesus. Because when we follow after Jesus, he actually calls us to something really, 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 really uncomfortable. And that's to embrace people who are different than us. And we can sometimes think, well, I can't do that then. I don't want to embrace someone who looks different than me. But really, this is no different than what Jesus himself has done for us. He has changed us. Let's go to the next slide here. Go back one. Yeah, and one of the things I like, what I like about this parable is that I wonder if there's no names on the characters because we all play the part of the different characters in the parable. At all points, I'm sure some of us are more like the priests, holier than thou, trying to be good followers of Jesus. And we can sometimes get blinded to the law, blinded to love because of the law, and we pass on the other side when there's a real hurt. Or we're Levites who also do the same thing. Maybe sometimes we find ourselves as the person who's beat up on the ground. And we can identify with that going, yeah, I've just been attacked, and the people who I would expect to come and help me, I'm laying on the ground, my eye has been swollen shut. And you see someone coming, and it's like, oh, here's the priest who's coming down the road. This is the person who will show me mercy, and they actually take the long way around. I'm sure we can identify with that at times in our life. Some of us might identify with the Good Samaritan, where you've actually come and you've encountered someone who is so very different from you, and yet you still felt compelled to show them compassion and love and hospitality. In this, next slide, the lawyer is looking for the minimum obedience required. Jesus, what's the minimum that I need to do that I can follow it and still be good enough? This is like the question that you ask, and like you might be asking it in like those who are finishing up high school now. What's the minimum required mark I need on my science test to pass? If I can just get that, is there extra credit? I need that extra 4% that puts me over. We're looking for what's the bare minimum obedience required, but Jesus actually changes it, and he says, no, I want total obedience, and it's going to cost you something. And he continues to reinforce this idea that hospitality to those far from God demonstrate our devotion to God. Okay, right? We talked about this the last time we were on this, where it's actually in how we live out our relationships with each other, to the extent that we love other people, shows our extent to how we love God. Because we can't be good with God if we aren't good with other people. We can't have messed up relationships but say, I'm still good with God. The hospitality to those far from God demonstrate our devotion to God. But here Jesus takes it a little bit step further. It's not just within the walls of our believing community then. It's not just the people who are most like us. Jesus then breaks down the walls and he says it's actually so much more than that. You are then actually required to love people who look vastly different from you. And let's just be honest, that's hard. It is. I have a hard time with it. Not because I don't love people, but because it makes me feel uncomfortable. It's way easier to gravitate to people who are more like me than it is to gravitate towards people who are less like me. But yet Jesus demonstrates as saying, if you actually love me, if you want to love your neighbor, it actually means loving everyone, even those you don't normally gravitate to. In fact, even those you might be repulsed by. Jesus' parables afflict the righteous or afflict the people who are persecutors. They make them uncomfortable, yet the parables comfort those who are afflicted. If you're the person on the road, this parable is good news. If you've been the one who's been beat up, you're just looking for someone to show you mercy. This is great news. Jesus says, you want to love me, you gotta love other people in the same way. If you're the priest or the Levite in this parable is uncomfortable news. Because it means you have to step outside of the things that you want to be doing, that you're naturally drawn to. But this is where it comes from. Let's do the next one here. So it kind of leads us to the point going, okay, so what does this all mean then for us? If we're going to be a church, what does it mean to be neighborly? Because really this is what Jesus is talking about. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? Where it's these people that are very different from me. It's people that are like us, true, but it's also people who are very different from us. So what does it look like for us? And I think there's two things. There's one that can be individual, where this ought to convict us. It convicts me on my relationships in ways I don't like, but it means an individual thing where I have to internalize this myself and realize I need to show grace and love and mercy and justice to people who are far from God and who look very different from me. So there's an internal processing that I have to do, just like there'll be an internal processing that you have to do, where the Holy Spirit will convict and spur you into the right direction for who you are being drawn to. But then as a church, I think there's a responsibility too, whereas the body of believers, we then have a responsibility too. Because if individually we're supposed to care for people who look differently than us, then corporately we ought to do the same thing. And we can't do all things. We can do the best that we can. And so when we're looking at how do we then become neighborly at MAC, I think it actually takes a couple things that we can do that are actually probably less intimidating. If we put the time in, we could probably do a really, really good job at this. And the one thing that we're going to be doing is that over the summertime and heading into the fall, as a staff, we're going to be working really hard to try and figure out the systems of expanding a welcoming and connecting ministry here at MAC. If we want to welcome people, if we want to love people who are far from Christ, eventually they're going to show up here. If we are being the light to the world, if we are being magnetic, and we're like, hey, just come and experience not just what the programming at the church offers, but come and experience Jesus' presence here on a Sunday morning with us. And when you invite someone in, when someone's seeking after God and they're feeling called, going, maybe I'm going to give church one last shot. Maybe I'm at the end of my rope and whatever, all the self-medicating, all the self-help books, whatever it might be, I'm finally going to give church a shot. And when they walk through those doors, we can love them by being prepared for them. It's us being able to show hospitality. It's similar to when you invite someone over to your house or when you've gone over to someone's house. There's always been that awkward moment when you go over to someone's house and they weren't expecting you. And you can kind of hear, you ring the doorbell and you can kind of hear the scurrying happen behind the doors as they kind of like just try and make their house like presentable and not totally a disaster. Or if someone rings your own doorbell and there's that panic where you're still in your pajamas, you're like, I need to make it look like I'm not a slob. And it's like 2 p.m. and I probably shouldn't be in my pajamas anymore. And so it's like you're putting on the pants as you get to the door and they come in and your house, you're just not prepared for them because you want to welcome them in a way that shows love for them. And in our culture, when we welcome them, we just prepare our place for those who are going to be here. Well, I think as a church, if we just always have that posture of wanting to offer hospitality to others, it just means that we're just prepared in ways that when people come in, we're not caught off guard going, yeah, I think there's a clean cup you can have around here. And say, no, come in. I'll even show you where you can park. I have a space ready just for you. Let me open the door for you. We have coffee that's on. Would you like some coffee or tea? We can expand our hospitality and welcoming in a way that shows someone, you're loved, I love you, and the way that I'm showing it is that I was prepared and ready for you. So we're going to be expanding that. And there's going to be opportunities for you who have hospitality gifts. Hospitality is a gift of the Spirit that is given to some of us, and some of you just have this amazing gift at breaking down walls and making people feel welcomed. And we need you on our hospitality teams. And hospitality is not just cooking food, but it's opening doors. Some of you have been kind of frustrated by our parking lot, and you already have a sketch of where you can park things better. Hey, we need people who can welcome people out in the parking lot and say, hey, we're so glad that you're here. I'm ready for you to welcome you here. Some of you might have tech gifts, and you're like, hey, you know what? I want to actually help on the technical side of things, in the back end, making sure our web presence is great. Let's do that, because when you go somewhere, what do you do first? You look them up on the internet, right? There's all these different things that we want to expand this so we can be welcoming to those who are far from God, because that's how we can show people love. We're also going to be kind of doubling down on our life groups. Many of you have been in life groups for a long time, and it's great. It's the way that we have our community. It's the way that we're able to care for each other and meet with each other. We want to pour some gasoline on that fire and have life groups be a major pillar and backbone of our church. Because you're in community in a life group, we want the life groups to be life-giving. We want them to be something you look forward to each week when you go. We want to support the leaders of the life groups with having relevant material that follows what we're doing on our sermons. We want to be able to find an easy way for someone who's new, who says, I want to get connected. We're going to be working on that to build our life group so that we have this connection, because when you are in a life group, then you're actually able to show love to other people because you're aware of their needs. So often we can go through life and we have this facade up saying everything's good, everything's fine, I don't want to show you my cracks because then it shows how not fine I am. But when you're in community and in a life group, you're actually able to be honest with people about what your needs are, and you're able then to go and meet them And in the same way, others are able to meet your needs. And they can celebrate with you when things happen, when babies are born, when weddings take place. They can celebrate with you, and also they can mourn with you when things go sideways and wrong and there's a diagnosis and they need someone to sit with you and to pray for you. That community is what's going to get you through, and you're able to care for each other in those ways. We want to do this really well, because we could almost rephrase the investing in each other to just saying we're neighborly, we care for others. And it's this active posture of us going out and caring for others, instead of in a spot where people would say, I want to be invested into, so I'm going to sit passively as things come into us. And we want to shift that, because we understand how we love other people is evidence of how we love God. And if we can get this part right, this horizontal part right, then we're going to have the vertical right. And we can't divorce them from each other. In fact, they are interconnected. When Jesus tells this parable, he's just starting to kind of show his cards a little bit about what his real mission on earth is. He said it very plainly before, but he was now going to move it from saying it to living it out and being able to give his body as a ransom for many. And he's going to say this is just idea of Good Samaritan is not just, an idea that we think about, but it's actually something that's put into practice. Caring for others who are far from you is not just something that's a good thing that we might want to look at, but he says, I'm going to show it with my actions. And so Paul, looking back on the life of Christ, was able to identify that this is exactly what Jesus did. In Romans 5, he says this. He says, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this, is that while we were still sinners, Christ died for this. This is good news. He showed us that while we were enemies with God, he came for his enemies. While we were theologically opposed to him, he came to us. While we were actively rebelling against him, he came to us. And not just to condemn us. No, he didn't come to the world to condemn the world, but to save it. And he offers his life as a ransom for many. And then he says, go and do likewise. This radical hospitality from Jesus. It shows that in how he prepared a feast for people. We get to feast a little bit later with a celebration barbecue, which is a great way of building community. In fact, one of the things that we want to be doing is that we want to be able to have this community where this feast takes place on a regular basis. So we've actually planned it, and we have dates in the calendar that 4 times a year we're going to eat together as a whole big church family. And people are going to be different from us, and they're going to look different than us, and they're going to have different backgrounds and different beliefs than us, but we're still going to eat together. Why? Because we're modeling ourselves after Christ, who did the exact same thing. On the night that he was betrayed, Jesus took his disciples to the Passover, and he said, hey, this is what I'm going to do. He says, this food that we normally celebrate with, I'm going to take a little bit of a twist on it. And he says, I'm going to make it that this is my body that's been broken for you, this bread. And this wine, this is actually going to be my blood that's been poured out for you. And in the presence of people who were actively trying to kill him, in the presence of people who he knew were going to betray him and run away, Jesus prepares a table for him. And he says, I love you so much, I'm going to invite you to eat with us. I'm going to invite you to eat with me. I'm going to invite you to feast on me so that you can have this new life where even when you fall short, I'm not going to. But I'm going to keep inviting you here, and he prepares a feast for us. We're going to have communion together today, and we're going to have an opportunity to come and to sit at his table, so to speak, realizing that what Jesus has done for us is the same thing that we ought to do for others. I'm going to invite the team up here as I kind of wrap up. The worship team can come up here. So we have communion, and communion, we have Jesus who then says, hey, come and experience me. My fullness, my body broken, my blood poured out. I love you so much that even when you were actively rebelling against me, I still come and I still offer myself to you. As a church, we want to be like that. we have the aspiration to love people who are different from us, and we're going to fall short. And if you're new here, I just want to say how glad and grateful I am that you're here with us. I hope that we are a church that can live this out in a way where we can put our actions into, put our words into actions and love you here. We're going to fall short, and I appreciate your grace as we do that. But we always want to come back to where Jesus is and what he has done for us, and so he has prepared a table for us. And so I invite you to come forward. You can follow the directions on coming up to the front and then and out to the side. We have 2 communion stations here. And this is a chance where you get to encounter Jesus, where he has prepared a table for you, even if you are theologically opposed, even if you are actively rebelling, even if you are kicking and fighting against him. He says, no, I welcome you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to show you love. I'm going to show you mercy. And you get to experience him. There's going to be servers that are going to be available up in the balcony to do serving. And then also, if you're here and you have mobility issues and it's not comfortable to come here, we're going to have people who are able to serve you as well in that way. But I invite the communion servers to come forward, and then the band will lead us through 2 songs in worship, and we will come up, and you can come and take the bread and the cup and make your way back to your seat, and together we will eat and drink. So I invite you to stand as the band leads us in worship together, and as we feast at Jesus' table. Thanks, you may be seated. In your hand you hold what Jesus said is, this is my body, this is my blood. That while you were still far from me, I came because I loved you and I would lay myself down for you, so that you could have life eternal, that your sins could be forgiven, that you could be right with me, and not just that, but also right with each other. That through Jesus Christ, the walls have been broken down that once divided us. The things and the people that used to be far apart no longer are there, that through Jesus we have a living hope. That the grave could not hold him, his death was not forever. In fact, he went as the first fruit of the resurrection so that we might follow after him. And together we get to be in that spot where he comes and he says, do this in remembrance of me as I seal the covenant, that I have done everything, that you don't have to do anything else to earn your salvation. It is done. And because of that, you get to go and you get to love people in my power, the power that not even the grave could hold down. So let's eat and drink in remembrance of what Jesus has done for us. On days when we have communion together, Lord's Supper together, we also take a special offering that is a part of our benevolent fund. This benevolent offering does not go towards the general operating expenses of the church, but in fact, every dollar that gets given to the benevolent fund goes directly back into our community to help people in times of need and helping cover the costs that sometimes come up, providing food, providing care when we need that. The ushers will be at the doors that you can give to the benevolent fund that way. I encourage you to give generously. You guys are such a generous church. It's so great that we get to love people because of your generosity in this way. And then there's also going to be prayer available at the front here. If you'd like prayer for anything, I invite you to take part in that. Prayer is a way that we're able to be connected with Jesus, but we also get to be investing in each other because we're able to meet people and care for them in the times of where there's hurt, where there's pain, confusion, whatever it might be. The prayer team is available to pray with you. And then we also get to eat together. So we get to eat not only at the Lord's table, but we get to take that Lord's table presence and we get to eat together in the gym with the barbecue. There's been people who've been working all during the service to prepare that for us. Let me say grace for us so that we can just kind of move into that. We don't have to worry about it. But let me say grace for this meal. Jesus, thank you that you have finished everything, that it is finished, that religion has no power on us, calling us to abide by rules and to prove ourselves worthy. You have taken care of that. Thank you for the blessing you've given to us. We acknowledge that the food that we have is a blessing that comes from you, and we just say thank you. Thank you for the food that we get to eat. I just pray that you bless our time as we fellowship together, where we eat and we get to laugh. May it be marked with joy and laughter. Thank you for what you are doing here. We give you praise in the only name that can save, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, everyone, let's go and eat together.